Excited that you all are here. Excited to talk about the last 90 days. As Jason mentioned, there's a lot that's happened, and it's been exciting and an exciting time for AI. So, what we're seeing is AI moving into your apps. And what does this mean? This means that we're seeing less and less, although still valuable, of the back and forth chatbots that we've traditionally been used to, and more about AI taking multiple steps for your work. So, this is the agentic side of AI. We're seeing four major vendors out there currently. So Anthropic, Microsoft, OpenAI, who makes ChatGPT, and Google, who does Gemini. And with every one of those vendors, they've leveled up their flagship models this last quarter. So with Claude, with Anthropic Claude, we saw Opus 4.8. With ChatGPT, we saw GPT 5.5. Google, we saw Gemini. And the really interesting thing here is we saw our first new class of model announced as well. So we'll get into that a little bit in the timeline, but that new class of model was called Mythos, which is just an interesting shift and change and increase in capability. We're also seeing that vendors have realized that having so many different interfaces that you work within is confusing for us. So we're seeing ChatGPT and Microsoft, for instance, taking a page out of Anthropic's playbook, where Anthropic did a really good job to make it more user-friendly, where we have chat, we have the Cowork, which is the agentic side, all in a single app. So we're starting to see that come out now. And the promise from OpenAI is they're going to merge also their interfaces into a single kind of super app as well. And so these two leaders out there really, they're both one-upping each other over and over and over again. And you'll see that in our timeline. So where Anthropic started as a business first and enterprise first company, ChatGPT and OpenAI started as more of a consumer slash business company. And what we've seen in the last quarter, or a little bit more than the last quarter, is OpenAI and ChatGPT leaning more towards the business side. So even though they had that big hefty base of consumer, they're leaning more into the business side. What we're seeing with our customers across the board and also just out there in the industry is a preference for Anthropic Claude. And so in our customer base, we're seeing new projects at about a 10-to-1 leaning towards Anthropic Claude. So folks are realizing that that might be the platform that they want to be on, and they're voting with their dollars on the adoption side.
Right. Before we move on really quickly, we're going to pop up a survey. We're curious to see how folks on this call are aligning with what we're seeing. So that should be popping up momentarily, and just be interested to see what other folks are also seeing. So we'll move on to the next slide and bring that back.
Sounds good. And by the way, I'll say, if you happen to be in ChatGPT and not Claude, both are excellent platforms. So both are very, very capable and have very comparable feature sets. So don't feel like you're getting left behind and you need to make a pivot. Just what we're seeing is more of the leaning towards the Anthropic Claude side. So what happened in April? Well, we had Claude announcing this new class of model called Mythos. And so they didn't actually release this. They just announced it, and they gave it to a few select partners. And the reason why they didn't release it is it had this capability that far exceeded where current models are. So they wanted to be careful. They wanted to be safe. And more about that in a couple of slides. And it's interesting here in June, kind of how this is all panning out now. So they also released Opus, kind of their frontier model. That was another jump in capability. OpenAI, not to be left out, released their Images 2.0 model, which is a super capable images model. It allows for really great infographics. It allows for editing of photos as well, more precisely. So you can think of OpenAI, ChatGPT, image generation, and Google Nano Banana image generation as the two that are kind of leading that space for image generation. And then we saw at the end of the month, OpenAI released their 5.5 model. And so this brought their capability back up to where Anthropic was with their 4.7 release. And so at the beginning of May, we saw some other interesting components happening. So companies started shipping industry suites. So Anthropic was the first to do this. And they shipped Claude for financial services, Claude for legal, and Claude for small business. And we see other vendors doing similar things, and we have a little bit more on that later on. We also saw that OpenAI continued to roll out other types of models. So their voice model, they released the new version of that, which is just another jump in capability for the back and forth voice, for live translation, et cetera. Google, not to be left out, brought additional kind of intelligence towards that agentic side of its platform. So that's with Spark, it's with Gemini, it's with Gemma, et cetera. And then towards the end of the month, Anthropic said, hey, OpenAI, you can't be in the lead. And they dropped their Opus 4.8 release, which is another jump in intelligence, which is just kind of amazing for all of us.
So it seems like we can probably expect to see this continual back and forth, right? Between
Well,
those two players.
we'll see. I have a little bit more on the next slide about
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Okay. This one I couldn't leave out because I thought this was kind of a neat story. So Google rents compute from a rocket company. So Google, that is Google buying compute from SpaceX. And by the way, Anthropic did the same thing in the previous month. So Google itself is a hyperscaler, and this is how constrained compute is. Google actually went in with SpaceX to purchase a good chunk of their compute in their large cluster. So interesting times for sure. What we got when we remember 2 slides ago, we talked about Mythos, that new class of model. We got to play around with that. So we got Fable 5, which is Mythos with some guardrails around it. And it was incredible. And we got into it, and it was very amazingly capable at all kinds of tasks. And then a couple of days later, the government suspended access. So they asked Anthropic to pull it down for all users a couple of days after launch. And there's many reasons why. The most popular reason that was cited was bypassing guardrails that they had in place for that model. So we expect it to come back at some point, but this is the first time where we've seen the government step in and say, hold on, this thing is too capable. Let's bring it back for a moment. And that's an interesting story that I think is going to pan out over the next 90 days.
Yeah. I would imagine, yeah, Stephen Hicks is probably going to have want to share a little bit about his perspective on that in his next office hours too. So a little plug there for that.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll be great. And so we saw also new additional open source models. So these are free models that are under MIT licenses, but free models doesn't mean you can run it on your MacBook Pro. These still require hefty compute, but we saw the first free model in GLM 5.2 that's somewhat comparable to the leaders in the frontier here, OpenAI and Anthropic, at least in that core set of space that they work in. So that was interesting. We have more information about this kind of changing idea of how we purchase compute, how pricing is going to change in the future, and kind of what we're seeing. That's this Cowork story, Copilot Cowork. So this is inside of Microsoft. We're seeing some interesting indications there. And then finally, OpenAI went to go release their 5.6 release, which is that Mythos class of their model, the new class of model. And the government said, hold on just for a minute. This is very capable. Let's do more of a staged rollout and a limited preview to make sure that things don't get away from us. So this was as of like a couple of days ago. So what I think we're going to see in the next quarter is maybe not the same speed of model release, and we might see some gating that happens for protection as well.
Oh, I'm behind here. Wrong button. There we go. Now I'm on it. Sorry.
Okay, so these built for industry plugins are kind of amazing. They're starting points. They're really starting points. And so Anthropic released Claude for legal, financial services, and small business. And so a couple of examples, these are plugins that include skills. And so the skills and connectors as well. And so the skills might be doing contract review or redlining, for example, in legal, or connectors to Westlaw or iManage. Financial services has their own set of items that are going to be skills associated with them. And on the small business side, we have plugins into common platforms that small businesses use. So PayPal, HubSpot, Canva, and we have skills built in to do some of the workflow associated with those as well. We're also seeing that Microsoft and OpenAI are embedding these as well in their platform. So one of the most recent things was the word plugin for legal. So I believe that's still in Frontier. So that release. So we're seeing Microsoft putting out items also specific for an industry, and then OpenAI is releasing these packs as well. So this is where we talk about, gosh, the future is a little bit hard to predict right now because everything's moving really fast and vendors are also changing their pricing model. So this is an example, a story. So Cowork inside of Copilot, Microsoft, when they first announced it, and by the way, like there's so many things called Cowork and Copilot, and it makes it super confusing, but this is the
It does.
Microsoft Cowork in Copilot. When they announced it, they said $99 in addition to your regular Copilot license. And then they kind of pedaled it back, and then they decided to just include it with your regular 365 Copilot license in preview. And so it was free. It was no additional cost there. And then once it went out of preview into GA, they changed the model on us again. And they said, you know what? We're not going to do the $99 a month per user. Instead, we're going to do consumption based. And what I think this tells us is we're going to see more and more of this consumption-based pricing in the future. And the best way to protect yourself where you can is going to be to select annual plans where you can lock that pricing in, at least for the foreseeable future. So this quarter too, another thing highlighted is the enablement gap. And so what do I mean by the enablement gap? We have a large majority of people using AI tools. We have folks that need to understand how to leverage these tools. So you have the tool, and then you start to have this gap between the tool and what's possible. And we're also seeing that engaging in training, whether it's self-paced training, whether it's train one-to-many, really provides that leverage that you need in order to get the most out of the tool. So you can see kind of tool alone, it grows, but it grows at a lower rate. But tool with training, you're going to get way more out of it. So you're going to have a basic rollout. Then you might do role training, or you might do specific group training. You might do guided training or small sessions or work on workflows together as well. And that will help bridge that gap between just tool and what can be done with the tool. And in that, you're going to have folks, some of you have probably heard me say this, folks that are leaning into the technology. You're going to have folks that are leaning away from the technology, and you're going to have a middle group of people that are happy to use the technology, but they just need to know how. And so this enablement gap, this training helps to bring everyone up, and then you get the most out of the tool possible. And then they inspire each other, right? Which is exciting. It's this flywheel. It's building a fire. Something else that became much more mature this last 90 days are skills. So as we talked about some of those industry-specific plugins, and by the way, those plugins, they're free. They're already included in your subscription. So the Claude for legal, Claude for financial services, Claude for small business, those are all included if you have a subscription to Claude. Skills are what is a piece of what comprises those plugins. So why do skills matter? They're kind of the leverage layer, and they're portable. So Anthropic open sourced these skills. So all of the vendors are using them in the same way now, or mostly the same way. So that means you can take a skill from one platform and you can bring it to another platform. And what is this skill? This is your iterative back and forth with the large language model. You might start with an idea and go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And all of a sudden you have pages and pages of detail that are important and massaging to get your result that you want. You can use the skills. It's very meta, but there is a skill to build skills. You can use that skill in order to build your skill based on that chat. And then you have that for the future. And instead of having that big iterative back and forth, you just invoke that skill and it takes care of what you've done in the past. And then those skills are shareable with other folks as well. So good examples of those: newsletter generation, scopes of work, proposal drafts, getting those in a consistent format, brand guidance. SOPs are really useful to have a standard operating procedure that's the same, but with the detail that you need in there over and over again. Branded slides, signatures for companies, building a signature that's adherent to your standard, that's consistent across every person for their Outlook, for their email is a great use. And also personal writing. So I want Claude to talk like me. I don't want it to talk like Josh or Jason or like it wants to do by default. So you can build your own personal style skill as well.
All right. Kind of hard to not give it to give an update and not talk about privacy and safety. So
yeah, I have to talk about this.
Stephen will be happy.
Stephen will be happy. And this is not something that's new or changed in the last 90 days, but it's just so important. And so you really have two branches in privacy and in these products. You have the consumer side and you have the business side. And they really do truly have different privacy policies associated with them. And so if you're using this for business, you definitely want to be in a business plan. This is going to have training turned off, for example. That's a common question we get. How do we prevent our data from being trained on? And it's going to have more strict and adherent privacy policies that you would expect from a business platform. I left a couple of links below if anybody's curious about reading deeper, but you definitely want to be in the business side. At home, consumer is fine, right? But at the business, you want to be on the business side so your IP stays safe.